fire break out. And so, but we are going ahead with the seminar, is the good news. So in a slightly unorthodox location. So I'm presuming everybody online can hear me okay. Can somebody confirm online? Can someone? Yep.
Can hear you.
Great.
Yeah, perfect.
So I'll just start the PowerPoint and then we'll introduce our speaker for the evening. It is the evening now. Okay, great. Okay, so everyone, welcome to the memorable and inaugural nature seminar series. So some of you may remember our tropical forest seminar series that we still, which we've had for many years. We've slightly mutated them from now on to be everything to do with nature recovery, including a lot of tropical work as well. So we're not abandoning the theme of tropical forests, but we're covering a much broader range of topics there. And this is very strongly linked to our new Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery and the activities there. So if any of you aren't on the mailing list for the Leverhulme Centre or the Biodiversity Network, the email is biodiversity@ouce.ox.ac.uk, and that will get you onto the mailing list of all these events there. So just to kick off today, we have a lot of interesting speakers, hopefully less eventful than Nathalie, but who knows? I think we've got Tony Juniper, head of Natural England, talking in a couple of weeks' time. We've got Guy Shrubsole talking about his new book on the rainforests of Britain in a few weeks' time after that. So there's a lot of really interesting talks coming up. But I won't waste any more time now by going through that. And we'll introduce Nathalie, and I did have an intro that I managed to hold on to in all that chaos. So Nathalie is from France, did a master's in biology at Paris, and then did her MRes and PhD on population dynamics of roe deer at Lyon. And so very much started off as a population ecologist, but then she worked in Norway on the impacts of climate change on the food dynamics, population dynamics of deer, and also worked in Canada on similar issues, and moved to London to the ZSL, Zoological Society of London, in 2006, initially working on cheetah population dynamics. So clearly has sort of moved quite a long way from there, and generally now does a whole range of work in the area of climate change ecology, biodiversity and monitoring, including using remote sensing techniques and the broad theme of nature recovery. So thank you for joining us on this special day, and over to you.
Do you have anything to switch, or can I?
I think perhaps just use the mouse keys there.
If I move you so that you can actually see it. Otherwise, I'm going to be systematically on the front. Do you want a chair? No, I don't need a chair. There we go. Is that good? But first thing first. So first of all, this is my favorite seminar of my career ever. I never had that where you get there's a fire and then people follow and still motivated on a Friday evening to go and uncover. I absolutely salute you. I mean, I'm amazed. So thank you for being here. Thank you for coming to this. Despite everything else, I just hope Tony Juniper isn't going to go with flood or earthquake. The next step up in a.
Let's show your slides. We haven't shared the slides screen.
Oh, well, so far so good. We haven't missed any. Had I known this would be like this today, people would remove doors, move sofas.
Okay, can online see the slides? Okay.
That's great, thank you.
Okay.
And I just move it like that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm here today to talk to you a bit about rewilding. And it doesn't work. It still doesn't work. No. Okay, I'll do it like that. Don't worry.
By the cursor key, maybe?
No, doesn't work either.
Yeah. Let's go to the PowerPoint.
You might have to go out of no?
Zoom, yeah.
Out of Zoom if you put, yeah, and does that work?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah. We're good.
I know you don't know. That's good. It's complicated. So share.
To anyone worried about giving presentation as an early career, see, it can get worse.
Where is that? Down here?
Top
Left?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
display.
Okay.
I know you can see it there.
Can't see the mouse there. Can't see the access that mouse there.
Anyone has an idea as to how to fix it?
I just can't get my cursor onto this.
yeah. So display.
Okay. So now back to Zoom. The problem is when you're.
If you leave it like that and I do this.
The problem,
Yeah, it works. It works.
The problem is that I'm not sharing the screen on Zoom. So,
oh dear.
So I need to. No, let's go a try. My cursor again. No, I seem to be totally paralyzed with the cursor. Okay, Zoom. Where's the it's painful to watch, isn't it?
It helps. A couple of weeks ago, we had a seminar in UCL, which was hybrid, and the speaker lost his voice the day before, but he gave the entire talk whispering.
I'm not going to do that.
Okay, it works. I think it works.
For enough, all of you.
I think with that you can use the.
Yeah. Ta-da! Nearly there. Nearly there. You work with me, I work with you. So, rewilding. I'll start again by simply remembering the context in which we're working, so which you all know, but I like to start with that just to remember what kind of environmental context we're dealing with as ecologists. We have an accelerating climate change crisis with the latest IPCC report basically telling you that it's going high, it's going quick, it's going fast. But at the same time, we have a biodiversity crisis, and I'm sure you have seen the LPI, the Living Planet report was out this week. And it's going quite down. I mean, 70% of the index going down. In the UK, you have lost over 50% of biodiversity. So we are really facing a biodiversity crisis. And the problem is that those two are intertwined. So when you're losing biodiversity, you're basically losing the ability to sequester carbon. And at the same time, you're losing the opportunity to adapt to climate change, because nature helps in terms of flood and water movement. It helps in terms of a drought and heat wave and temperature regulation. But at the same time, climate change is impacting wildlife and is triggering a loss of biodiversity. So basically, there is a real need to think joined up and to tackle those crises in unison. But when I say that, that nature recovery is at the heart of tackling the environmental crisis that we're facing, I don't mean nature as just trees, because trees on their own are not going to get us out there. First of all, clearly we need to think about reduction in emission, but most importantly, biodiversity is really important for that ability to sequester carbon and to adapt to climate change. So it's nature, not just tree, that is really central to tackling that environmental challenge, meaning that nature recovery is really a priority, which is why we are, for example, in the UN Decade of Restoration. Now the question is, we have understood that we have a problem. We know that we need to recover nature. What do we do? And how do we deal with that climate change and the biodiversity loss crisis? Well, there's a number of things that we can do. We can change our diet, which will have a lot of impact on our emission. We can think about clean energy and getting away from fossil fuels. We can think about circular economy and recycling, which makes us out of that trashing the environment, pollution type of thing that's really impacting biodiversity and also impacting climate change through emission by production. And we can think about nature recovery. But if we think about nature recovery, we have multiple tools in the toolbox. We can think about land protection, and I'm sure you have heard about the 30 by 30 target that is being discussed as part of the Convention on Biological Diversity COP that is happening in December. You can think about stronger environmental standards and laws. You can think about traditional restoration, or you might think about rewilding. Now, if we think about rewilding, the typical question is, well, what is rewilding? So if you think about rewilding, this is a term that appeared in the 80s and has been booming for the past 10 years in conservation biology. It found its origin in something called the 3C, which is carnivore, corridor, and core area. So the concept originally was about protecting those big areas where there's lots of carnivore and stuff, and then having corridor and connectivity to try to protect biodiversity that way. But the thing is that since then, the concept has evolved quite a lot. Now, from 2010 to the last decade, you have seen a plethora of definition of rewilding. So from some definition that really talk about the restoration of species and ecological processes to more broad and vague concepts such that returning a non-wild area back to the wild, to a definition that really insist on addressing the dysfunctionality of ecosystem, to some that really think of species and functional type that have ecological importance and putting those species back, to some other definition that really think about habitat protection for big animals, carnivore and other big species. And so I played that game in 2018. I also start to think about what is rewilding, what makes it different from what exists. And for me, it was when we came up with the definition in 2018, we thought that what was missing from all the definitions so far is the concept that you're not operating in just an ecological space. You're operating in a social ecological space. And so we wanted a definition that acknowledged that you have to deal with people, basically. What happened then is also that there was different type of rewilding, so there's different definition and also different school of thoughts. So some people were well, actually one of the oldest type of thought was the Pleistocene rewilding, which is all about doing stuff to restore ecosystem processes that were found in the Pleistocene. Then you have the whole trophic rewilding movement, which is people that are very focused on trophic interaction as a way to enhance the complexity of ecological system. And then you have the ecological rewilding, which is basically people that see rewilding as doing something ecological, not just trophic interaction, broader than that, and not linked to a specific type of specific timeline, so not like the Pleistocene. And then you have the passive rewilding, which is basically the thought that sometimes the best thing you can do is do nothing, because things come back naturally. And those different type of rewilding have coexisted in the literature. Now, unsurprisingly, but 5 to 10 years ago, and still now to this day, I would say, a lot of people got confused as to what rewilding is. And if you look in the news, because the rewilding, the concept of rewilding really got started with the George Monbiot book in the UK, the book Feral. Rewilding attracted a lot of attention in the media. It sounded good. Therefore, that it started to get used anywhere from Carrie Johnson wanting to bring elephants in Africa to rewild, to people thinking that if you're taking a tiger cub and you ablate it you rehabilitate it to hunt and you put it back in nature, that's rewilding. To people, I mean, it just got confused. And my favorite is actually this one that just said, who really understand what rewilding is, which gives you this sense of a lack, a confusion over the term. So what happened is that 5 or so years ago, the IUCN, which has different commission. So the IUCN is an organization of scientists and is science-based advice and guidelines for people working in nature conservation. And they have different commissions. There's a commission on species survival. There's a commission on environmental management, etc., one on governance, one on laws, one on education, and soon one on climate change. Within the environmental management commission, a small group that started as a task force decided to create or to define rewilding for the IUCN. The way they did it, though, was to bring 30 or so people, I think, or a little bit more. They did some consultation with what they call the true rewilders, and then try to map what rewilding would be. And then they published a paper in 2021 where rewilding is defined as the process of rebuilding following major human disturbance a natural ecosystem by restoring natural processes and the complete or near complete food web at all trophic levels as a self-sustaining and resilient ecosystem using biota that would have been present had the disturbance not occurred. So that's the state of play with the IUCN. What happened, though, is that a lot of people in the IUCN didn't really think that this was the way to build consensus in the IUCN. Because if you think 2 seconds about rewilding or any kind of big major environmental approach, you can't just leave it to one commission. You have to have all the commission involved. And also you can't really leave it to 30 or plus experts. You have to build consensus. So therefore you have to do huge consultation to try to really build some strong scientific consensus. And so a motion was passed in 2019 that called for the creation of an inter-commissional working group on rewilding to really set up the rewilding definition, principle, and guidelines. And that group is currently operating, trying to produce all of that for the IUCN for the next World Congress. Now, that doesn't help you to really know what rewilding is, right? so I think for the moment, where we are landing in terms of an understanding of what rewilding is really understood as a conservation approach that supports the reinstatement of natural processes. That's one of the stuff that most people agree. In functionally degraded ecosystem, that's another thing that people agree. You don't rewild stuff that are doing well already. Putting them on a trajectory to being more ecologically complex and less subjected to human intervention. And I would say that is probably in that space where the concept of rewilding will probably land. But let's see what that working group comes up with. Now, rewilding has been going on for quite a while now, and there's, well, not quite a while, relatively, for the past 5 to 10 years. And there's actually been a lot of projects that have declared themselves as rewilding all over the world. But if you can see this primarily in Europe, I think the rewilding concept has a real traction to Europeans. And indeed, if you're looking in Europe, I would say the UK has been particularly engaged with the rewilding concept. And if you look at all the recent headlines and even more until then, everybody's going for, let's just do a rewilding project somewhere. Let's go there, let's do this. So it's a real traction in it. The interesting thing, though, is that because it comes from this 3C carnivore core area, big stuff, which is an American type of conceptualization to start with, there's kind of an idea that you can only rewild big empty space of some sort. And so there's starting to get some discussion as to whether you do rewilding everywhere or in some specific ecosystem. Now, if you think about rewilding under the definition that we were just looking at, rewilding cities works too. Actually, you can rewild any kind of ecosystem because what you're trying to do is to make an ecosystem more functional. And the fact is that urban ecosystem are a type of ecosystem. So this week, there was the publication of the IUCN typology of ecosystem. And you can have a look. It's a beautiful description that is now being used by the IUCN to drive the process of red list of ecosystem assessment, which is a type of prioritization for ecosystem conservation. You will see that urban ecosystem are there. So the fact that urban ecosystem can be rewilded, the fact that a lot of cities hold a lot of biodiversity means that urban ecosystem, or like any other ecosystem, can be rewilded. And indeed, if you look at the Carver paper, where you have this really cool figure that looks at the continuum of human modification, so less modification, more human modification. And here, where you think about increasing the ecological integrity and quality, you'll see that all the ecosystems that are listed include urban ecosystem. So I'm not saying that you're going to have giraffe and lion in the urban ecosystem, and I'm not saying that all rewilding projects in urban cities should have large carnivore. What I'm saying is that if you accept the idea that rewilding is about making your ecosystem more functional, then you can always do that a little bit. And the amplitude of how much you can do that may vary from one ecosystem to another, but that doesn't mean that you cannot engage with the concept in any kind of ecosystem. So another discussion that has been going on in the literature is what's the difference between rewilding and restoration. Restoration is something that a lot of people understand well because it has been there quite a while as a part of a conservation tool. Rewilding is really new. There's been a paper some years ago that actually asked, is rewilding just a repackaging of restoration? Or are we just trying to reinvent the wheel, put the new name? And is there really a difference? Which pushed some of us to really think hard as to whether that was the case or not. And here is what are the attributes that we thought could be highlighted as difference between the two. So if you think about the relevance of historical benchmark, to which extent you're trying to recreate something that existed before, you would say that restoration has the relevance is relatively high, rewilding is slightly lower. If you think about the fidelity to taxonomic precedents, remember that IUCN definition from the Commission on Environmental Management, it was using the biota that would have been there should have the disturbance not occurred. Well, restoration generally have a higher relevance or fidelity to taxonomic precedent, while rewilding has a lower fidelity. In terms of predictability of system dynamics, because you have more management going on in restoration project, you have a higher predictability of its dynamic. In rewilding, because you're trying to decrease management intervention and somehow the control that you have over those natural processes, the more unpredictable the systems are. Management commitment over time is a real a difference in attribute too. In restoration, you generally commit to continuous management. In rewilding, you're looking at tapered or minimal intervention whenever you can. Motivation for translocation is also another thing that people get confused over. So people think that as soon as you're doing translocation, you're doing rewilding. No, if you are translocating for something that has to do with species composition, you're much more into a restoration because you're trying to recreate something that looks a state in a way. But if you're really worried about function, as of that, does that ecosystem work or not? And if it doesn't work, what is it missing and what kind of species will help get that functionality back? Then you're into the realm of rewilding. Taxonomic substitution is another thing that make a difference. So generally, it's resisted in restoration, while it's much more accepted in rewilding, because in rewilding, what matters is the function of the species, not really its identity. And environmentally driven system transformation is also more resisted generally in restoration than in rewilding. Emergence of novel ecosystems, something that many people would have heard, is generally more resisted in restoration and more accepted in rewilding. And another one that we didn't put in our paper 2019 is the cost per hectare. So if you're doing restoration, because you're committing to management on the long term, you're looking at a much larger budget than if you're thinking about rewilding on the long term at least. So here we try to explain that using this famous dynamic model, where you're looking at how ecosystem reorganize following a disturbance. So if you're thinking about a system that is doing well, which is roughly here, which is doing in climates, and then you put a disturbance. What happens is that generally the system kind of goes completely haywire, and then it tends to reorganize, to then try to go back into an exploitation loop, to go back into that climax. When you're doing restoration, you're trying to avoid some of them. So you're trying to avoid that exploitation, some of the release. You're trying to go as quickly as possible from the disturbance to back to the climax. When you're into rewilding, you actually accept that things needs to go and reorganize itself, etc. So you let it go through that exploitation loop to then go back on its own to a climax. Or you accept that it might not reorganize the way it was before, and then you let it go into another ecosystem. So what's exciting about rewilding? Why did I start to work on this, and what did I find really interesting with the concept? The first thing is that I'm a climate ecologist, so I'm very aware that things are changing really fast. And what's interesting with rewilding is that you basically accept that things can't stay the same. So you're really working with dynamic. You're thinking about functioning instead of thinking about state. And you're focusing on processes instead of focusing as to whether this is there and wasn't there before, should be there, etc. You also embrace unpredictability and lack of control. So you have this attitude of let nature do its thing, or said differently, you accept that you don't really understand some part of the ecology. And so therefore you might think that nature might find a way that you might not think straight away. What's also interesting is that you bring up the issue of coexistence and acknowledges that discussion or about socio-ecological system, because where are those environments that are degraded? They are where people are. And so you can't just come up and say, well, you all fuck up. I'm going to do that and I'm going to do whatever you have to deal with people. You have to talk to people. And that in conservation, we have done some very well, but we haven't done it to that extent, especially when it comes to nature recovery. It's also interesting from a climate change perspective, because, well, rewilding gives you a really cost-effective way to increase carbon capture and storage capabilities, to provide food protection, to dampen the impact or suppress the impact of wildfires, to enable the rapid emergence of novel functioning ecosystem that capitalize, for example, on those species on the move. And then you might have some impact, and so Binder can talk to you about this, of delaying the impact of climate change on some key ecosystems, such as in the Arctic. In cities, it's even more interesting, if you ask me, because this is where people are. They really depend on that nature to really help buffer the impact of climate change on their livelihood and on their life. And so nature recovery in city can really increase the rate of water infiltration and slow down, therefore, water flows, therefore reducing the impact of flooding. It can reduce the risk of river bank collapse, again, and erosion, so impacts on the flooding probability. It can help cool cities. If you were in the UK this summer, you know what I'm talking about. As soon as you start to have nature, you really have a decreased temperature, and it makes it way more livable when it's 39 degrees or more. It reduces the impact of air pollution. It can promote the establishment of drought and heat wave resistant species because you don't control what is being planted. So, well, you might start it if there is nothing in the seed banks, but you can also let it grow as it colonizes naturally. You can buffer biodiversity via microhabitat creation by ecosystem engineer, because if they come back by themselves or you introduce them, those ecosystem engineers can create a lot of things that help the rest of biodiversity deal with something like a drought or a heat wave. And then you mitigate the facilitating effect of those extreme natural events, and that these have on infectious disease threat to public health, something people that don't think about, but climate change might bring a lot of disease to people, and biodiversity through its complexity can actually reduce the impact on that on people. Another thing that people don't systematically think about is the matter of scale and budget. And here is an example from Romania that I think really illustrates the point. So this is a big national park. No, it's not a national park. It's a big area in Romania, which is full of forest. And there's been quite a lot of deforestation over there in the 90s and 2000s. And so what happened is that a charity has been purchasing some land, and I can't see it very well, but it's those little polygons in this way. As well, some of them were purchased because they were relatively quite intact, and therefore they wanted to purchase it to avoid logging. The other bit was they purchased some area that were really damaged to try to restore it. And so what we did here was to compare what has happened in the last 10 or 15 years, I can't remember, in those three areas. So in the polygons that were bought for restoration, in the polygons that were bought for just purchase, so nothing happened, and in the wider landscape, which it turns out has been quite abundant for the past 10 or 15 years. And then just compare how much forest came back. So the green tells you how much the ecosystem has gone back to having more forest. And what you see is that restoration really good at bringing back forest because you put a lot of effort into trying to get the forest going. But restoration only happened in like a quarter of those polygons. So although it works super well, we're talking a few hundred hectares. But in the wider ecosystem, which is most of this, actually 9% of it moved towards forest, with most of it not moving at all. And so although it's less in terms of percentage, we're talking thousands of hectares because it's most of it. And that gives you an idea of how those approaches have completely different way to transform the ecosystem, different costs, different benefits. Of course, there are tension points with rewilding, quite a lot of it, and there's quite a lot of discussion. The first one is that people have different vision as to how large should a rewilded area be. And you see that particularly when you start to talk about urban rewilding, because some people get really annoyed about those meadow patch of garden in a city. Why would you do that? Well, if you start to think about the urban ecosystem as a compilation of patch, and if you start to think about how those patch can help connectivity, then you can see why it's interesting. But if you're coming with this with the concept from the 3C, big area, lots of carnivore, etc., and of course, the meadow will be less appealing to you. But the point is that there's a tension point here. Although this is bridging more and more as we talk every year. The corollary question is, of course, whether rewilding is possible at all spatial scale. Then there is the whole thing as to whether you should have people in rewilded sites and whether you should have people excluded from rewilded area. And then there's this whole question as to what's an acceptable wild nature. Actually, what's a wild nature? Should acceptability be defined in terms of composition of similarity to historical benchmark or novel ecosystem wild? That's just a typical question that you can see too. And are ecosystem without predator, large predator, wild? And so what happened here that we don't systematically talk about is that all of us in this room have a completely different vision of what's wild. And that is a clash of a culture, background, vision, whatever. But some people would think that a wild garden is wild. Some people think that it has to be a vast area without people. Some people think a novel ecosystem is wild because it's rearranging itself and therefore it's doing its stuff. And some people think that a vast area with people is still wild. So the point here is that we have to start to acknowledge that different background or structuring that discussion. There is the other tension point, and there is tension around monitoring, because in a way, a lot of people want to engage and do stuff and don't systematically see the point, the value of actually monitoring what you do as you do it. And there's also people that think that if you're having this vision with minimal intervention, it also goes with doing no monitoring, which is not systematically helpful when you're trying to develop the science of rewilding. We have very little discussion and understanding as to how we deal with risk in rewilding. What are the risks? How do we quantify them? How do we talk to people about them? And then discussion around how we integrate rewilding with existing policy framework, which are primarily focused on composition and not systematically on processes. And then finally, there's also the issue as to how you fund rewilding project. So if you think about conservation and how funding mechanisms work, you have to say, I'm going to go from there to there. And therefore, can you pay me to move from there to there? With rewilding, you can't really say that because you don't know where you're going exactly. And so it introduced some kind of variability that the funder are not systematically ready to prepare or have found a framework that works for them in terms of funding. So if I dive a little bit more into that policy context and financing, there's a huge variation in local policy context. And the legislation around biodiversity conservation, land use and agricultural, they can vary significantly between country, between region. And so what you can or cannot do is really different for the moment. Also, this idea about funding is that when you're rewilding, you're kind of committing to a long time scale. And so for the moment, conservation is not really good at identifying and having a framework for trying to secure low level of long-term finances to really secure and get those projects going, so that it makes a difference in terms of having time to get more ecologically complex. And then the discussion about factoring the cost for action. So rewilding project might be costly to start with because you have to kickstart a lot of new ecological processes. So you might do reintroduction, etc. And that generally is thought through, but the long-term cost and the cost around public engagement and getting people on board are generally underestimated, which threatens sometimes the stability and the successfulness of those projects. Now, sometimes I go to people and they're like, we should all do rewilding. Why do we bother with restoration? It's climate change. Let's just stop restoration altogether. We should just do, it's cost effective, it looks good. I just made a really good case for it. Why should we do restoration? Well, there's a lot of reason why you should not suddenly, divest a lot of money that goes into restoration into rewilding. First of all, it's because, as we were discussing with the Romanian example, the area for rewilding and restoration can be very different in context and in attributes, particularly in size. There are areas where you can't do rewilding. It's just too unpredictable. It's not big enough. It doesn't work, whatever. Restoration is a possibility and vice versa. So it depends on the local context. You have to think about what's the budget, what's the people, what's the community, what do they want, what are they prepared to accept? And that's something that does one thing doesn't fit all. So, but if you have multiple tools, you have more possibility to engage people with some form of conservation. And as said before, they are linked to different levels of risk and budget, and they work at different speed. And here, the point here is to realize that, as said, when you're trying to work in different contexts, there is no size fit all, never in conservation. There's different tailored approach that would be best. And one of the jobs of an ecologist is to think about what can work where and how can we move that forward. And so that, therefore, having a portfolio of approaches is a much better thing. So you don't want to do one or the other. You want to have the possibility to choose depending on where you're working. And also, another thing that is interesting when you're thinking about restoration in rewilding is that because we spent a lot of time trying to explain the difference between the two, which we had to do to explain that rewilding was a scientific concept, not just a fad. Yeah, we kind of forgot to also think about what are the synergies, why they are both interesting. And there's multiple things that are synergetic in this way. So first, if you have different tools, you increase the space that you can use for conservation. So you increase the number of opportunities for recovering nature. Second, restoration ecology is an old science, much older than rewilding anyway. So they have a lot of data, science, evidence-based knowledge that can really be used for rewilding. Not all the time, not everything, but there's a lot of knowledge exchange that should be fostering more discussion between those two communities. Also, because they work at different speed and at different scale, by having both going together, you're increasing the heterogeneity in your landscape. And we know that heterogeneity is good for biodiversity. And finally, because you have more space, because you're able to work in more spaces, you can increase overall connectivity, which again, we know is really important for biodiversity conservation. So you'll be happy to know that that's my last slide. What are the conclusions of that talk? What are my key messages? The first one is that nature matters everywhere and to everyone. And that I really want to emphasize that. Going around saying that some nature is better than others that some places needs more, that are more important ecologically than others, etc., is not really helpful. All ecosystems can be rewilded. You can increase the functionality of nature everywhere, and it should matter because different people relate to different ecosystems, and actually engaging with that diversity is really important. And it's also important within that, when you're doing that, you're kind of forced to acknowledge and reflect on the diversity of value in conservation. This stuff as to what's wild, which is really important to engage an increased audience with conservation. The second one is that rewilding is just one tool in a toolbox. And as I've said before, it's not replacing restoration with rewilding, but also it would be wrong to just think about nature recovery aspect as restoration in rewilding. There's a bunch of other things that needs to happen, such as better laws, such as trying to tackle the practices that we know are affecting biodiversity negatively, such as pesticide, such as artificial moons, might up there. And then the third one is, I know you're all relatively early careers, it's younger than me, I think, mostly, maybe not you. But the point is that I want you to go with that message. There's a bunch of stuff we don't know. Yeah, so we do really need you. There's a lot of knowledge gaps. There's a lot of things we don't know as to how to recover nature. We don't know anything about things that have to do with risk, as we saw. We don't know about how to rewild. When does it work? When does it not work? How do you monitor it? We have to build bridges with society. So there's a lot of social ecological work, economical work as to how we deal with legislation, as to financing. And then there's a whole bunch of work to do to build scientific consensus through the IUCN processes, but more widely so that everybody in the room and elsewhere feels confident that rewilding is a scientific concept, that it should be treated as such, and then there's knowledge gap within that. And I think that's it for me. So thank you.
If you're okay, I think we'll take about 10 minutes of questions.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. If only more people could listen to such a comprehensive talk, and then there wouldn't be so much confusion about what rewilding is. But my question to you is, when you were sort of coming up with the definition and trying to see the difference in synergy between restoration and rewilding, did you ever consider kind of repurposing, because restoration ecology has also been developing as time progresses, the definition's been evolving. So did you consider redeveloping the definition of restoration to include rewilding? And so why did you choose to make it a different concept? Because now you explain rewilding versus restoration, which people can, misinterpret.
Yeah, it's a good question. I didn't choose personally to do that, but I think there is value in actually, so whether or not you can think as restoration as basically nature recovery or not, or whether you adopt nature recovery and you see restoration as stuff as different pros and cons. I think that it is useful to have two different things, and although acknowledging that there are areas where they overlap, so passive restoration and passive rewilding is very, very near. But the point is that if you make the difference, you're better able to identify the knowledge gaps. So if you put everything in the nature recovery, then it becomes very muddy in terms of focusing the research question and trying to engage. And the fact of approaching conservation management with low intervention and being able kind of give that space for that tool. So I think there's pros into actually thinking that, and I don't think recognize, so trying to make everything, because we could just say that everything is conservation. So, and then we stop with that. The problem is that it's actually so if you think about translocation, they had the same problem, right? So originally it was reintroduction, then they went into translocation, then the assisted colonization. I mean, there's a lot of different ones, and they went the path also to make the difference, because the motivation and the approach is slightly different, and therefore how to do it, which might be tailored to different contexts, and so whether you go with one or the other is useful when you know and make the difference. I think there is a good case for it, if that's helpful.
So just to follow up on that, so the rewilding in some ways is the aging cool kid on the block. Is there any evidence that it's drawing funds away from restoration activity, or is it, to use an unfortunate phrase, like expanding the pie, so that we actually there's more resources in the whole conservation area?
I think we're too early to really be completely sure about that. But I would say that the circumstances for engaging for one or another sometimes differ widely. So imagine a big area, you wouldn't be able to restore it. It's just simply not the budget. But there might be the budget to actually go with rewilding because the cost per hectare is relatively smaller. And the practicality sometimes, especially with passive rewilding, is something where people can live a little bit more, they are more likely to go with it because it's happening anyway, if it makes sense. So I would say that this is something that there's a risk around it, that's for sure. So there's a risk that the cool kid on the block might suddenly divert, but I don't know whether there's enough evidence for the moment to really, so it has to be understood that the rewilding projects are really, really new. As of very, very little has been implemented. There's a lot of decision and headlines, but actually on the ground, it's really, really, it's not that developed and not that known, which is why I would say this is something to look for as a risk, but I don't think the evidence is there yet.
In India, though, they introduced the African cheetahs
Yes.
in India, and
Yeah.
it's the most expensive conservation project in India so far.
Yeah.
And the case is to protect the grasslands. So all the people who've been working on grasslands over there for ages are really annoyed because it's such a
But you would,
funding limited.
is it rewilding?
I don't know. Is it
Because-
rewilding?
Well, so the question would be to which extent the reintroduction of cheetah changed the dynamic in such a way that it would change the functioning of the ecosystem to some extent. So is it suddenly realized, are they reintroduced in an area where there's no predator and therefore it would have an impact on
No,
the
they're totally
so not all reintroduction or rewilding. This is one of the stuff that I was trying to say. Yeah.
So first, kind of procedurally, would it be possible to make the slides available?
Yeah, for sure.
I was also wondering, you talked about scale and budget.
Yeah.
But I'm also wondering about scale in terms of actors. So state actors obviously can do a lot, but you also see, for instance, in Scotland, some very rich people buying up quite a lot of land. There are issues around how much engagement there is with Scottish people.
Yeah.
But also, what about, individuals? If we look at urban, presumably individuals can do a fair amount.
Yeah.
But, what is it worth people who have the opportunity buying an acre or two nearby and trying to rewild it, for instance?
I think it depends on what are the contexts and stuff. So the law of conservation is that if you do something on your own without engaging everyone around, the likelihood is that it's not going to stay long, because you can't just change the planet on your own. But if you're in a situation where there's willingness, there's engagement, there's stuff, etc., then it's possible. So the garden is a good example. So if you make your garden more likely to have a native plant, etc., you can increase connectivity, you can create more habitat and stuff, etc. But if all your neighbors gong on you and basically say that it's a detriment to their property and stuff, etc., you can't persist. You kind of leave. And in a way, it might look like a constraint, but actually, I think that's the whole point, is that conservation is not just an ecological science. You can be passionate about stuff. If you're unable to explain that to other people and you go, heads on, focusing on what you think is right and thinking that everyone around you is wrong, you're not going to go anywhere. So it has to be a conversation, and I agree that it creates problem wherever there's not that conversation doesn't go. If you start a conversation by saying you're wrong, I'm going to tell you how right you should be by doing that, you never go anywhere. You just don't. There.
That's fantastic to kind of get definitions and actually kind of look into what rewilding is and isn't. I think that's really brilliant, and that was kind of clarifying for a lot of people. But to be provocative, do you think that,
No.
but to be a bit provocative, do we think that with all the connotations and discourses that the wild has, is rewilding the correct term to be using for this type of?
I've used that before, and I mean people go around that. It's so the contract to this is that you have so many people engaged with it Are you really going to go? No, you're all, no, we're just going to change because you do that. Is it better to do that? Or is it better to say, well, let's just talk about what the wild means. What does it mean to you? What does that mean to me? Should we try to build a consensus as to what this is? Because we can't go around with our different background and view and then try to impose it to the other saying you're wrong. And I think that has the power. So sometimes difficult words are helpful. And maybe rewilding is actually, because it pointed at all the problem that we have in conservation. Yes, the wild is a terrible, I mean, it's a difficult concept. As I was telling you during the meeting we had this afternoon, there was this Survival International report published earlier this week that said there's a lot of words that actually conservation-wise are terrible. Wilderness being one of them, because it has colonialist, because it has racist stuff. And so you can either say, oh, well, let's just not talk about this, just a new word that looks good, or you actually confront it. And then so let's talk about this, because clearly that's a tension issue. Clearly that's a problem. Maybe we should need to address it and try to do as if it doesn't exist, never address anything.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd argue that it's an emotive appeal in what gives it power and traction. But people have this need for the concept of wild. And if you replaced it with like process-based restoration, I think that
no one's
they're going to lose that entire audience.
Oh yeah, thank you, Bob. I wonder if you see any issue or even maybe danger associated with tying rewilding to climate change mitigation. Just that you see perhaps there could be cases where rewilding could be carbon neutral or even carbon negative. In those cases, is that something that we shouldn't pursue, or do we need to frame it differently?
So we don't do conservation just for carbon. Yeah, that's for sure. But then neither should we say that we just do conservation for the sake of conservation and we don't care about carbon. So there might be area where there's a win-win. And when there's a win-win, you can engage more actors, because some actors are very motivated about carbon right now. I think to me, the issue is to understand first that how carbon works, because a lot of people just think you plant a tree, you have carbon, that's nature. It doesn't work like that. And the second step is to understand that this is not just about carbon, because you can help climate change with adaptation. So a lot of people are obsessed with mitigation, reduce carbon, and they don't really think about, but how do you help people to go through what's coming anyway? Yeah, and that's adaptation. And nature has a huge role to that. And that's not just the tree, there's also other type of thing. And so I think that's the dialogue that we need to have, talking about sequestration and mitigation and adaptation, not just mitigation.
I was wondering, well, first of all, thank you. Yeah, lovely presentation. Do you have any case study that, well, if you would pick one project of rewilding from all that you get to know, which would be the one that would be the best kind of example this far?
I think it's an interesting question, because best for what? And so best, to me, all of them are interesting, because they all have their flaws. They all have there's things that went well and things that didn't go so well, things that inspired, things that created conflict. And so what's actually interesting is their diversity. And the thing is, actually, I love diversity, frankly. That's why diversity in people, diversity in project, diversity in biological diversity. It's exactly the same. You learn more by by all of them, by seeing at what works well here, but not there, and stuff. So if you think, for example, the the Netherlands one, Overstadsplatsen, yeah, it's an interesting one because it's engineering and stuff, etc. But it went really bad because it's fenced and they let all those pony dies, all the people were going up their arm, and it's really terrible PR. Didn't think about NEP. We were talking about that this afternoon. Some really cool positive stuff, because they did increase the complexity, the ecological complexity. They did change the ecosystem, etc. But early on, they didn't engage so much, and there was a lot of conflict, and they didn't go so well, etc. But there was some interesting points, so that they developed their funding mechanism with the private sector instead of thinking just about ELM. So there's different scale, different problem, different things. Different ecosystem also. So something might work very well in one type of ecosystem, not on the other. And we are still at the point where learning, I think, because it's so new. And also what we call rewilding project is vastly different. Yeah, some stuff is just bringing beavers, and it does change the function, so it's a rewilding project. But it is relatively different from something like NEP, where you take something that was really problem type of thing, and then try to rebuild everything, bringing back stuff, etc. Completely different settings, different people, different community. So it's actually difficult to have one. Maybe 10, 15 years when we are better at recognizing those different parameters and think about what really is important. Which one will be there in 15 years? That's a good index for success. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Have you seen any trends in national legislations when actually the conservation legislation, nature, laws for nature conservation has included rewilding?
Not so. I think that is one of the reasons why rewilding, at some point, wanted to define itself as restoration.
Yeah.
Yes, because then it created a bigger opportunity to interact with the law. I think if it moves in other stuff, there's going to need to be some adaptation. So the fast answer is no. For the moment, there's still a huge focus on composition and not that much on functionality. And that's partly is due to us being quite rubbish at saying how functionality works. And at also having this ecosystem vision and this idea of how ecosystems are they doing well, not well. We're a little bit too far off from hitting the stuff. So I think there's both a change in legislation that needs to happen, but I think the ecologists also need to come back stronger on being clear on what kind of information can you use to say, this is doing better, this is not doing better. Frankly, I think we already have some good answer. I think I'm a pretty big fan of the red list of ecosystem because I like this idea that it's all about functioning in a way and telling you whether an ecosystem is doing better or not. And it integrates those different variables. What you don't want to have, which you see in a lot of countries, is the proliferation of index with everyone saying, no, you should use mine. Well, you know, you use this one, it's really better. And then you have like 50 of them and no one integrates them and you're like, which one? The red list of ecosystem does that really well by saying, well, give me all your information. We'll just integrate it. And then here is the answer. Here is a risk category, which is what the red list for species does. And I think that's how to get out of that loop.
Last time.
Yeah, how should rewilding projects approach invasive species? Do they have a role to play, or
that's a really good question. Again, I think there is a lot of conversation to have with invasive species experts to actually define the realm of places where you might or might not work with them, etc. So why I'm thinking about that, so don't get me suddenly saying that I want to put invasive everywhere. No, what I'm trying to say is that there has been some example in Denmark, I believe, where they have shown that for some of the most degraded places, the really polluted one, the only thing that would grow on it is invasive. And so if you wanted to kickstart something, you had to work with them. So that opened up the question as to, you know, do we completely say no to everything? And I don't know the solution to this. Let's be clear, because it's a complex problem. But I think there's a case for having that discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, in South Africa, the African black oyster catcher, it's one of our like really common coastal birds. It suffered a huge decline in the past, and then Methodologies provincialis, one of the black mussels, invaded the coastline, and the population of black oyster catchers has just boomed again, and now they're just not getting rid of the mussels because they're not harming any of that species on the coastline, and they've helped to aid in restoration. Well, like bringing back this species, that's really important too.
But that's going to be, I think that's going to be one of those tricky situations where conservation used to have guidelines for that works everywhere on the side. You know, we've been very good at giving a solution for all. And now we're realizing that actually context really matters. So we're going to need to tailor a bit into harvester. And that's going to be a sensitive discussion and a difficult one. But I think there can be a consensus built. There can be a discussion. It's an interesting discussion. So what do we do where? How is it okay? When is it not okay? And I think if we can have that discussion in an interesting way, and by that I mean no bullying, no awful interaction between scientists trying to protect, but actually really have a calm one, it will be a fascinating one.
What is the viability of the wild and open spaces, especially in the face of increasing climate?
So what do you mean?
Like in terms of like turning cities green.
Well, so I don't want to switch a urban ecosystem to a forest. So what you want is not to, so as long as you see a city as a damaged forest or a damaged, you're not going to go anywhere. As soon as you start to think of an urban ecosystem as a urban ecosystem and how to make it more functional, you're going to get somewhere. And that's what you're trying to do. You're not going to try to suddenly put, I mean, you know, it's not about putting wolves and lynx in the middle of London. No, but it is about, there's a lot of really key biodiversity. It's a biodiversity hotspot, London. Yeah. Some of those populations are not doing so well. How do you make that better? How do you complexify your urban ecosystem? If you start to think like that, you go somewhere. But as, seeing those environments as trash helps no one.
Yeah. For those of you interested in urban ecology, we have a talk by Lena Chan in November on Singapore as an
Yeah.
city for urban country.
I have to say that if you're interested, we also published a report, Rewilding Our City. This is ZSL one where we features a lot of Singapore actually.
Yeah, and you can
Yes.
see like, what a pioneers on this.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we'll wrap up there. Firstly, we've done quite a bit of wilding in this space, so make sure we do the restoration before we and second, an extra large round of applause for Nathalie.
No, to me is thank you. I have to say I've never seen so many committed people. So you made my day. Today you made my day. Thank you. Really thank you.
Fantastic. Really